Good morning, everyone. For those of you who don't already know me, my name is Cyrus Eaton. I work in the campus ministry office, and I have the great pleasure of introducing our guest speaker this morning. Our guest speaker is the author of the book, The Color of Grace. She is the founder and executive director of Exile International, an organization that exists to restore Africa's former child soldiers and children orphaned by war. She is a leader in the specialized field of war-affected children rehabilitation and has worked with global organizations like the United Nations and Global Trauma Recovery Institute. Her and her husband Matthew live here in Nashville, Tennessee, and lead the work of Exile International together. She will be, after her talk, she will be in the back. If you have any questions or want a copy of The Color of Grace or have it signed, she'll be back there. But before she comes up, you're going to see a quick video. And before that video, I want you guys to give our guest speaker, Bethany Williams, a very warm welcome.
My story actually starts when I was a little girl. My father was a preacher at a small country church, and I loved mission work. I loved Africa ever since I was young. I was married at 21. I had this dream of my marriage being this spiritual partnership and being perfect, and in reality, I just begged God to save my marriage for years. The marriage ended up ending in a very painful divorce. Broken decisions were made out of broken places, and I was really just immersed in shame. I just thought my life was over, and I didn't understand how God could ever use me again. That led me down the road into a severe depression, and even at one point I became suicidal. I ended up in a treatment center for post-traumatic stress disorder, and I'd hit the bottom. I didn't really have any choice except to reach up. Even though I didn't know how, I had to reach out for help. I actually sold my car to pay for treatment, and so one Sunday I walked to the nearest church, and there was a man speaking who had survived the Rwandan genocide, and he was talking about how God used his past to help others in Africa. So I ended up actually going to Congo for the first time with the organization that he founded 2 years after I graduated treatment. I was just in awe of the children that I met on that trip to Congo. They were in the middle of a war zone, but they danced and they played and they laughed. And it was on that trip that I met children so traumatized that they couldn't speak, that I heard stories of child slaves who were forced to kill. And I didn't have a place to put that in my head. Sometimes something touches your heart so deeply that doing nothing isn't an option anymore, and it becomes more about finding a way than it does about finding excuses. I just kept thinking, what if these were my children? I wouldn't have the option to look away, and so I decided I would fight for them. I didn't have a 5-year plan, and I didn't have a large sum of money to fund the vision. I just started putting one step in front of the other and prayed that God would step into the gap. And that's how Exile International was started. I met Matthew around 3 years after Exile International was founded. A mutual friend connected us, and he was actually doing work with sex trafficking victims and survivors of trauma internationally, and he was looking for an organization to work with. He was a counselor, and so we started working together and cautiously dated for a couple of years and ended up getting married, and now we run the ministry together. He's really been my greatest surprise in life. This story isn't one that I dreamed about when I was a little girl. I didn't dream about brokenness or divorce when I was a little girl, but it's really been beautiful to see how God has used my shame and my past pain to create beauty and purpose out of my darkest hours. I believe in my life and also in the children in Exile's programs that our greatest heartache has become and is becoming our greatest gift. And this story isn't even my story, it's really God's story of redemption, and I'm just honored to be a part of it. There are some things in life that you are not supposed to survive, but you do. Some stories so horrific that they beg not to be told, but they must. And other stories are so beautiful that they transcend human understanding, but these stories too must be shared and they must be told. These stories are lived out loud by children who have survived war and slavery. Stories like Devon. When Devon was 3 years old, her mother found her in the forest of Congo after being violated by rebel soldiers. Her mother scooped her up and carried her 2 miles out of the forest. She was unable to provide what her daughter needed. So she put her in the hands of a man who took care of her and took her to a facility for survivors of gender-based violence. And now she's a teenager. So Devon is radiant, and she's a leader among her peers. Her smile and her song tell her story of survival. Why is she strong today? Because someone believed in her. Because someone believed that she was larger than her past and stronger than her greatest pain. And then there's Nelson. He's a timid and a strong young man. He lives in Uganda, but when he was 10 years old, the Lord's Resistance Army stormed the village where he lived in the middle of the night, and he woke to sounds of gunfire and the piercing screams of villagers. Smashing into his family's hut, soldiers jerked him up from the mat on the dirt floor, and his hands were tied above his head and his feet were bound. For 2 days and nights, he was prodded by the butt of a gun. He was led deep into the forest. Slowly, he was brainwashed, and he became a child soldier. One of my favorite memories is actually sitting at his feet after he shared his art therapy drawing for the first time and told his story. And he wept, and I wept, and we held hands walking back to his hut. And during the final day together, he allowed me to wash his feet, which was just a symbol of beauty and redemption. So he's now a teenager, and he dreams of caring for orphaned children one day, children who've been orphaned by war. And why is he even able to dream today? It's because someone believed in him. They believed he was larger than his past and stronger than his greatest pain. And there's a little girl in the United States, and she lives inside the body of a grown woman. A woman who, because of her past and her pain, had given up on herself. She was utterly hopeless. But this little girl, this woman, found hope in the story of a little girl named Devon and a boy in Uganda named Nelson. Because of these children and many more, her greatest heartache became her greatest ministry, and her life came full circle. Because God never stopped believing in her, and because purpose can come from pain, and because redemption is real. I am that little girl, and I am that woman, that lady whose life was so sick with secrets and deep pain. I found courage to walk in the truth because I met children who had survived such horrors, and they were so brave to tell their story, and they were so brave just to survive. Through my journey through personal brokenness and redemption, the Lord has allowed me to start to see through spiritual eyes and helped me find answers to the greatest questions. When I began living for something bigger than myself, I actually found myself. And I stopped asking God to do something for me, and I started asking God to do something with me. And so my pain started to become purposeful. So in 2008, I founded Exile International as a catalyst to provide healing and to empower war-affected children in Africa. And my life really turned upside down. I often joke that reaching out for help when I was so depressed, God led me into a war zone, but actually it's true. It was actually the very journey of healing that intersected my path with children who had survived war, rescued child soldiers, former sex slaves, children who'd been orphaned. Because more important than a painful journey is what awaits us on the other side of brokenness. I've learned that God is not only a God of second chances, but he's a God of third chances, and he's a God of fourth chances. And I've seen this not only in my life, but in the life of the children that we're able to work with at Exile International. So my first trip to Congo in 2008, I met rescued child soldiers, former sex slaves, and I heard their stories of war firsthand. Women tried to give me their children because they just felt they couldn't survive in a conflict zone. These people spoke of guns and rebels as if we were talking about what we watched on TV last night. War was very commonplace for them and is commonplace for them. It's not new to Congo or Uganda. So soon after I came back from that trip, I barely left my room for 3 days. We had visited 5 displacement camps in 1 day on that trip. And I met children so traumatized because they'd watched their parents be brutally murdered that they couldn't even speak. And I knew I had to do something. I didn't know exactly what that was, but I knew doing nothing was not an option. And, looking away would have been easier. Going back to life as normal would have been easier. Turning on my television and numbing out my pain would have been easier, but I wanted to feel every emotion God brought to my heart because of what I'd seen. And I know this is really far from Nashville, Tennessee, so I wanted to give you just some background information. In the 2 areas that we work in Congo and Uganda, there were over 100,000 children who have been abducted. The average age of a child when they're abducted or kidnapped is 12 years old. The average time in captivity is 3 years. Children who are abducted, girls and boys, often are forced to kill, sometimes their parents, sometimes their siblings. They're forced sometimes to remove body parts. They're raped and sometimes forced to participate in sexual contact. Most of them, of course, have some symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. Many of them have been orphaned by war. And at Exile, we really believe that when a child has been orphaned, then that child becomes the child of a church. It becomes all of our children. So it's really our honor to start providing for that child and meeting their needs as if we were caring for Jesus. Through God's grace and through our partners, we've been able to serve over 3,000 children since our beginning. And it started with a dream of art therapy. This is a slide of one of the children drew, their art therapy drawing. When they draw, often their drawings are full of dead bodies or guns or burning huts, but that's just what's on the other side of their mind. So it's natural for them to draw that pain. And it started with a vision as well, and a thought and a dream. What if these children who had survived war actually could become the future peace leaders of their countries? And we're actually seeing that happen. We soon realized that the children were also hungry and they were homeless. So they needed food and they needed clothing and they needed someone to pay for their school fees so they could become educated and receive an education. So our focus then started to become healing mind, body, and spirit. And we saw the children totally come back to life again. So 7 years later, there are over 800 children weekly in peace clubs, and these are expressive therapy and trauma care groups. This is a picture of Matthew with one of our peace clubs in Uganda. These kids are receiving their very first Bible that they've ever had. So there are 220 children in our sponsorship program and 115 youth that live in the Peace Live Center in DR Congo. So before I go any further, I want you to hear from these children. Anytime I speak, I'm here really just representing them. I don't believe these children are voiceless. I believe they have voices and the voices need to be heard. So we're going to watch a video of 3 of our graduates who will be sharing a little bit of their story.
When I was 10 years old, rebels came to our village. They always attacked and looted at night.
They would take the women out into the forest and rape them.
They attacked us and kidnapped me and forced me to go into the woods. That's where they started teaching us how to be soldiers in their army.
We were forced to go. I was 14 years old and in secondary school when they took us away.
They asked who wanted to go home and who wanted to go with them. Some said they wanted to go back home. Those that raised their hands to go home were shot right there and then. They killed 4 kids right in front of me. Then they taught us how to steal, to kill, and how to attack others. They taught us every evil thing you can imagine.
I remember the first person I ever shot and killed. I watched him fall. At that moment, I felt something change within me.
It's not like we taught ourselves to kill. It was what they taught us.
I met one of the child and he told me that he has been able to kill 100 people, 200 people.
I watched people die like wild animals.
Most of the time, those children are not accepted because they are saying that they are rebels and they can do bad things. They ask, how can you help us?
When we receive a new child here at the center, we listen to him, as that is his greatest need. It's necessary that he tell us his story. How did he get kidnapped? What did they force him to do? And then we can help him depending on his degree of trauma.
The second program is teaching them peace. We teach about how they can forgive others and understand that they can be forgiven, and then how they can build peace in their village.
Earlier on, I didn't want to talk to anyone because I felt like I was going crazy. Now we've learned to talk about these things with others.
The teachings on trauma are really helping me. I am beginning to see the fear become less strong as I am healing.
We walk in.
So these youth look a little older in this video, but I wanted to give you a little bit of a background story. So this is Bahati. He was kidnapped at 10 years old, escaped. He was re-abducted at around 12, 13 years old. So he was actually kidnapped twice by 2 different rebel armies. You can imagine the degree of trauma that he has. Beautiful soul. He graduated the program last August, and he came down for a second wedding that Matthew and I actually had in Congo. It was a surprise wedding, which I could talk for 20 minutes just about that experience. But he came down from the villages, and we said, "How are you? Bahati, how are you?" And he said, "Well, I'm good, except I need a Bible." And I said, "Well, what happened to your Bible?" And he said, "Well, I was studying with one of the rebels, and the rebel wanted to know more about Jesus. And so I gave him my Bible." And then he said, "And actually, I need a lot more Bibles because I've started a Bible study with the rebel group that I used to be a part of. And they want more Bibles so they can learn about forgiveness and they can learn about Jesus." And he went on to say that he's actually using the trauma care curriculum that we use, and he is helping them through their wounds of trauma, which is remarkable. So now he additionally has started a group with 60 rescued child soldiers in his village, and he again is leading them through the trauma care curriculum and then also Bible study. So he's just a remarkable just story of redemption. And then I want to also tell you about Joyce. Joyce was abducted by the Lord's Resistance Army when she was 9 years old. She was actually forced to participate in the killing of her mother, which is a brainwashing technique, and it's not foreign to kids who are kidnapped by the Lord's Resistance Army. Joseph Kony is the head of that army. Of course, she was orphaned and abducted and spent 2 years in captivity. So we were interviewing her on one of our trips over, and one of the questions was, if the rebels were here, if Joseph Kony were here, what would you say to him? And she said, "I would tell him to come back home so we could forgive him." And I didn't really, again, have a place to put that in my head. We were walking back to her dorm room that night. And I said, "Joyce, can you help me understand that? Can you help me understand how you would even be able to think about forgiving him?" And without missing a beat, she said, "Because God says so. Because the Bible says to forgive, and so God says to forgive, so we forgive." And she also said, if we don't forgive, then the peace will never come in our hearts, which is very deep for a teenager, I think. You know, I realize that a lot of what I'm talking about is very heavy, and it seems hard to relate to. And sometimes when Matthew and I speak, we leave out details because it's hard to process. But we also believe if these children can go through this, then we can be brave enough to hear it, and we can be brave enough to talk about it. And in the beginning, for me, I really struggled with the question, where is God in all of this pain? But I realized the answer was really in looking in the mirror. The question maybe isn't, where is he? He is beside of them when they are afraid in the bush. He is holding their hand when they are abducted, running from rebels. He is right there with them on the battlefield and in the bullets. So rather than leaving us, I believe he's actually closest to us in our pain. So perhaps the question isn't, where are you, God, in all of this? Perhaps the question is, where are we in all of this? I have a final few thoughts to share. I believe when we begin living for something bigger than ourselves, we find ourselves. We find our purpose, we find our song. That doesn't have to be across the world. Most of the time, that's right beside of us. And sometimes we wait for our purpose to kind of hit us in the face, and we wait for our passion to surface before we truly begin living. But he's already given us our passion. Our passion is found by living out our purpose, and our purpose is found by living out the gospel, being the hands and feet of Jesus every day to those around us, one person at a time. That's how we change the world. And I've come to realize that many of us in America, we live in great spiritual wealth, maybe even drowning in those things that surround us, but we suffer a deep spiritual poverty and loneliness as we strive for more, and we try to fill our wounds from the outside in. But with those friends that we have met across the ocean who are living in poverty, they actually are living in this great spiritual wealth. So perhaps we are the ones that should be pitied, and perhaps we are the ones that should be prayed for. If we would learn forgiveness, resilience, gratefulness, and joy from these children, we would be radically changed, and these young survivors would be our greatest teachers. There's something greater than the children's stories of pain, and that's their stories of survival and forgiveness and strength. And one thing I know, the power I've seen in these children's ability to forgive and dream is stronger than any force of evil that stole their childhood. So I do not live in their pain. I will not, and I cannot. I will live in their future, and I will tell their stories, and I will retell them, helping the world to see who the strong ones really are, and giving the nations a glimpse of true forgiveness, showing the world a picture of real joy. And I know this is a lot to take in, and we can be overwhelmed. We can be convinced that we can't do everything to make all things better, and so sometimes we just do nothing, but I want to leave you with an encouragement. Do something. There are lies that keep us from acting. What can I do to change the world? I'm just one person. I'm young. The problem is too big. I don't know where to begin. But you don't have to do anything except just take one step, even if it's tiny. It's a step. So really the question is, what can't you do? And I know the world seems dark right now, but I want you to hear me say this. Light is bigger. I refuse to believe that there is more evil in this world than light. And ending crimes against humanity calls us to stand as a collective group, walking in the same direction. It calls us to see a man living across the ocean as our brother. It calls us to see a child slave as our son, as our daughter, as our sister, or our brother. It calls us to see humanity as a us rather than a them. And I believe together we can do more. Thank you.